All right, today we're diving into something a little different. We're going to crack open an ancient legal puzzle, a real head-scratcher taken straight from the Talmud. Think of it like this. We're the detectives, and we're going to follow the clues, step by step, just like the sages did thousands of years ago.
So here's the challenge for us today. How in the world do you solve a mystery that's thousands of years old when the only evidence you have is the text itself? I mean, there's no forensics lab, no witnesses to interview. It's all about pure, hardcore textual analysis. Okay, let's open up this case file. Our investigation centers on a really important sacred ritual from the time of the ancient temple in Jerusalem.
At the very heart of this whole thing is something called the guilt offering. Now, you have to understand, every single ritual in the temple had these incredibly precise rules, down to the tiniest detail. But for this specific offering, there was a huge question mark. Where exactly in the temple courtyard was this supposed to happen? The sages had to figure out the precise location.
You know, every good investigation needs a lead, right? A thread to pull on. So the sages did what they did best. They started combing through the biblical text, hunting for that first crucial clue.
And bingo, here it is. This one verse from Leviticus is our Exhibit A. It's the key piece of evidence because it directly connects our mystery, the guilt offering, to another sacrifice they already understood really well, the burnt offering.
So their initial logic here is just, it's beautiful. It's so clean. Okay, premise one, we know for a fact the burnt offering was always slaughtered in the north part of the courtyard. Premise two, the verse we just looked at links the guilt offering to that exact same place. So the conclusion seems pretty obvious, right? The guilt offering has to be slaughtered in the north too. Case closed? Nope, not even close.
And this is where things get really interesting. This is where you see the sheer brilliance of these sages as legal investigators. See, they weren't happy with just the easy, obvious answer. They needed to understand the full scope of this rule.
So they started asking the next level of questions. Like, okay, fine, the slaughtering has to happen in the north. Got it. But what about the other steps? What about collecting the blood? Does that have to happen in the north too? And hey, what about the person doing the collecting? Do they need to be standing in the north too? You can see how they're digging into every single granular detail.
And believe it or not, they found the answer in a single tiny word. The text says, "And its blood shall be sprinkled." That "and," it seems so small, so insignificant, but for them, that was the whole key. They saw it as something that extended the rule. So suddenly, it's not just about the act of slaughtering anymore. Now the rule also applies to the blood itself and even to the person doing the next action. The entire process is now tied to that spot in the north.
All right, but now we get to the real heart of the matter. This is the most critical question in the whole investigation, and it raises the stakes from just, a procedural detail to a question of whether the entire ritual is even valid.
So the big question is this. Is this rule what they call limitzvah, which basically means it's the ideal way to do it, the best practice, but if you mess up, the offering still counts? Or is it la'kev, which is a disqualifying rule, meaning if you don't do it in the north, the whole thing is invalid, thrown out, doesn't count?
So that's the central conflict right there. Is this just a friendly suggestion, or is it an unbreakable law? And the stakes here are massive. If they get this wrong, potentially countless sacred offerings could be completely meaningless. They absolutely had to get this right.
Now, to solve this part of the puzzle, simple logic wasn't going to be enough. They had to pull out one of their big guns, a really powerful and kind of complex tool for legal interpretation, a whole principle for how to read the text.
This is the principle they used. It's called the principle of the specific case. And here's the gist of it. If the main text sets out a general rule, but then it singles out a very specific situation, say a leper's offering, and gives it a new rule, that specific case gets pulled out and put in its own little box. It's like a legal spin-off show. It has its own rules, and those rules don't necessarily apply back to the main show.
And here's the roadblock. This is where they hit a wall. See, there was this other verse in Leviticus that also mentions slaughtering a guilt offering in the north. The problem, it was specifically talking about the offering brought by a leper. So, because of that spin-off principle we just talked about, this verse was stuck in its own legal bubble. It only applied to the leper's case, which meant they couldn't use it as evidence for the general rule. So their best proof for this being a hard rule just went up in smoke.
So what do you do when you hit a dead end? Well, this is the climax of the story. Just when it looked like the case had gone cold, the sages found one final clue, and this was the one that was going to break the whole case wide open.
So what they did was they laid out their two key pieces of evidence right next to each other. You have the general rule on one side and the specific rule for the leper's offering on the other. And when you look at them like this, something just jumps out at you. They both repeat the exact same phrase about slaughtering in the place of the burnt offering.
And that was the aha moment, the question that changed everything. You have to remember they believe this text was perfectly written, with not a single wasted word. So why would it repeat itself? Why say the exact same thing twice? There has to be a reason for that repetition. It can't just be an accident.
Okay, so here's how they put it all together. The first verse, on its own, yeah, that could just be a suggestion, an ideal practice. The second verse was necessary to teach us something specific about the leper's offering. But the fact that it repeats the location rule, that part was technically extra information. And in their system of logic, there's no such thing as extra information. Every word has a job. So what was the job of this repeated phrase? They concluded its job was to strengthen the rule, to elevate it from a simple suggestion to an absolute, non-negotiable, disqualifying requirement for all guilt offerings.
And just like that, there's the verdict. The rule is absolute. A guilt offering that is not slaughtered in the north is invalid. Period. Through this incredible display of textual analysis and pure logic, the sages had closed the case.
You know, this whole investigation really shows you something fundamental about how they approach these texts. Every single word, every repetition, it all matters. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other secrets, what other puzzles are just sitting there waiting to be decoded in these ancient texts if we just know how to look?